Hi all. If you are a returning viewer, welcome back. If you are new, welcome. My name is Amira, and today guys we are going to be talking all about the Natasha Denona Golden Palette and comparing it to its mother palette, its sister palette, the Gold Palette. Let's get into it. Alright guys, so as you can see my makeup is already done. I didn't want to do a demo or like looks because I feel like that's been done a bunch of times. You can find a lot of videos showing that. And also the Gold Palette itself is a pretty old palette and most people have a pretty good idea of what that palette looks like on the eyes. So what I did decide to do is I really wanted to compare and see how close the shades are, if they are a little different, if the textures are the same, if they apply the same. And I wanted to sort of do one eye using the new palette, one eye using the original Gold palette. And I'm not going to say which is which, but I used both palettes for this look, one for each eye. And if you can guess which one by the end of this video, I will reveal it at the end, but if you can guess, just put it down in the comments down below. So first off, let's talk about the OG palette. Let's talk about the Gold palette. So this is what the original looks like. It is probably Natasha's most popular. I would say this one and maybe Biba is her like most popular $129 doll hair palettes, like her original OG, very expensive, very luxurious palettes. This is the second palette that I owned from, or that I purchased from Natasha. The first one was Metropolis, and then I loved that one so much I decided to go ahead and purchase the Gold palette. The Gold palette is my second favorite after Metropolis of all of the Natasha Denona palettes I've owned and tried. So I'll show you what she looks like, which I'm sure you guys are very aware of. So this is the OG Gold palette. And what I loved about it and what I still love about it, because I still use this palette, it's an incredibly versatile palette. What I love about it is that you have these neutral tones, but then you also have a lot of these like really beautiful like yellow based tones, these really beautiful vibrant and impactful metallics, you know, lime chrome, which is very popular. You know, it's one of those shades that everyone talks about when they talk about the Gold palette. This beautiful cream to powder teal shade, this beautiful metallic teal shade. But the shades that I used the most, or continue to use the most with this palette, are really these shades and these shades. And I will say the thing that is missing from the new palette are those like grungy yellow tones. What she did with the Golden palette, I'm gonna be using those interchangeably, but it's the Golden palette. The new one is called the Golden palette. And I will say the thing that she did with this one is she really kind of took out all of the really interesting undertones. She did. So this really stands as an incredibly beautiful, neutral golden palette. There's nothing wrong with it. It's beautiful. I used this palette on my birthday to create my birthday look, which I actually recreated here. I'm using both palettes. But there is a specialness to the Gold palette when I open it up and I get excited to use it that it just doesn't have anymore. You know, one of my favorite shades is in the palette, and that is the shade Varus, which is this beautiful taupey metallic shade. How beautiful is that? So this is actually in the Golden palette, and I want to show you guys what I mean. So here is Varus, and as you can see, I don't know, and this could just be because my Gold palette is older, but I do see a slight difference, just very slight, in the way that these two look. So I'm gonna swatch both of these here on my hand, and they're the same, but there's something about them on the hand, on my fingers, and even on the eyes, that I did see a really slight difference. And again, that could be because the Gold palette is an older palette. The shade may have deepened a bit, but it does feel like it just has slightly deeper, just ever so slightly deeper than the one that is in the newer palette. However, I feel like unless you're, you know, if you're a layman, you're not going to notice the difference at all. But if you are, you know, a makeup, you know, insane person like I am, and I assume a lot of you are, we can tell the difference. I just see a slight difference with these. It's ever so slight, but when I put them on my eyes and I put them on my fingers, I could see a slight difference. The other shades that are in the palette that I think were good choices were she picked Teak, which is my favorite neutral. Excuse the cars, but this is my favorite neutral tone in the palette. And it's this shade here. So this is the newer Teak and this is the older Teak. So let's see. And again, you can see, I feel like you can see slight differences. I feel like this one is a little bit lighter. Again, it could be because shades are older. I don't know. But I do feel, and I felt when I was applying both to my eyes, I felt that Teak from the old palette was more pigmented. I will say the Teak from the newer palette blended easier. Could be age, could be because the formula is slightly different. I did feel that I was able to diffuse that shade better. But I will say that having used my gold palette and having had it for longer than the golden palette, I know how this palette performs. And the performance hasn't changed all that much from when I first purchased it, to be quite honest. It's pretty much the same. The shades are incredibly pigmented. They are deeper on the eyes and they look in the pan, but they do blend really well. They layer on top of each other really well. And I do find that to be the case with these. I just find that I think maybe something she's tweaked with the new one is that she's made it a little bit, they're still pigmented, but it's not quite as much. Like I found myself having to layer just a tiny bit more with Teak from Golden than I did for Teak from the OG Gold palette. I do like that we still have some of these like sparklier shades. So we have Kava, which is incredibly popular from the original palette. But I will say this, again, I felt a difference. So this is OG Kava and this is new Kava, and you can even see it here. Do you see the texture that old Kava has? Whereas the newer Kava is very, it's smoother. And I used this shade from both palettes. So this is OG Kava and this is new Kava, and you can just see that there's a little bit more body to OG Kava, and I used it in my inner corner for my eyes, and I did find that I had to build up Kava from the newer palette to get it to even match the intensity of OG Kava. So if you are someone who loved, who you were coveting Kava from the old palette and you don't own the old palette, I wouldn't say that this one is going to give you that same impact. I think you'll get something similar, as you can see, but you can even see here that it's like OG Kava is just slightly deeper. You see what I mean? So there are differences. I have noticed differences. I would say if you have never, excuse me, I'm getting a wet wipe so I can wipe my hand off. If you don't own the original gold palette, then I don't think it's going to matter all that much to you, unless, of course, like with Kava, if you're really looking for that high impact, super sparkle. It has some sparkle, but it has the sparkle, put it that way. It does have the sparkle, but it doesn't have the body and the texture that OG Kava has. I mean, you can even kind of see it in the pan. So this is original Kava. And you can kind of see, in my opinion, you can kind of see how it has a little bit more texture than Kava in the new palette. It's just a little flatter and smoother. So little tweaks like that I've noticed with this palette. I'm not unhappy with it. I'm glad that I picked it up. I'll also show you some of these other ones that are in the palette from the original. So this is OG Aria and new Aria. These are pretty much the same. Again, I still find that the OG is smoother and more pigmented, and you can see even the way they swatch, it just was, I got way more payoff swatching it than I did on the new one. So something to think about. And then let's look at some more of these golds that are in both of these palettes. So Alchemist is another one from the old palette, and I'm going to swatch both. So this is Alchemist from the original palette, and this is Alchemist from the new palette. pretty similar in tone and texture, so I think these are going to be pretty, they're dupes. They're the same. There's not a difference, difference in like depth of tone, texture, shine, color payoff, any of that. So this is pretty similar. I will say in the pan, Alchemist in the old palette, the OG Gold, looks a little bit more textured, whereas in the pan for the newer one, it looks smoother. But, and I was worried that that meant that, you know, it wasn't going to have as much payoff. But as you can see, they swatch, and I'm assuming going to apply. Have I used Alchemist yet? No, I haven't used Alchemist yet. So I can't tell you on the eye if it's going to be exactly the same. All right, next up we have Oro. And this is where I think things get a little dicey because, okay, so this is OG Oro and this is new Oro. And I just feel like OG Oro, this is OG Oro. It's just got, do you see what I mean? And maybe I'm just losing my mind, but I feel like this one has more depth and more texture to it than the new one does. And this is like that really vibrant yellow gold that everyone talks about in this. It's this one. So this is the original Oro. This is the new Oro. Still beautiful. But I just want to show you like in pan, and it could just be because of the background. Oro and this one just looks way more impactful. And I even feel like it looks a little bit more impactful on my hand. Like I just feel like the shimmer is brighter. But again, that could just be me. Maybe I'm using maybe my bias towards the old one is like showing in this moment. But yeah, those are both the really like vibrant yellow gold in both palettes. We also have Sandstone, which is another one of the neutral tones that are in the palette, both palettes. So this is the OG. This is the new. Again, the new one is smoother on application. I'm just gonna dip into both of these again because I feel like I'm not getting enough here. Hold on a sec. So this is Sandstone, but I think you can tell here, even with the way I swatch, this is Sandstone from the old palette and Sandstone from the newer palette. And I don't know if you can see how much that this one is just a tad deeper. Again, could be age of the palette, but I haven't had any issues with the shades changing color. Like this is an older palette, but it's not like a palette that doesn't perform the way it always has. So this is the original Sandstone. This is the new Sandstone. I do prefer this one. I've used both of these. I do get better payoff with this one because this one is just, because of the tone being slightly lighter, it just blends into my skin. It's just a little too closer, much closer to my skin tone than Sandstone from the OG palette, because the Sandstone from the OG palette, if you notice, had a little bit more neutral undertone. I feel like there's a little bit more of a peachy orangey undertone to the new one, just a little. Now let's check Aurum. And Aurum is a shade that I very rarely used in the old palette, but every time I use it, I'm like, why don't I use this more? So I really want to see how this looks. I will say that the one from the OG is smoother. So this is the OG Aurum, and this is the newer Aurum. And you can see that the newer one just has a slight, just slightly more texture. So let's try OG Aurum and new Aurum. And you can see the difference right there. So this is OG Aurum and this is new Aurum. So the newer Aurum is brighter. It's pretty. It's really pretty. I would say the OG Aurum is a nice offset to Oro. Oro is so golden that I feel like this one is probably a better match for that one. But this is really pretty. I like them both, but they are different. As you can see, they're different. But I like them both. I would say texture-wise, I think the OG Aurum is like more of a smoother, more traditional metallic, whereas I feel like the newer one is kind of in the same vein of some of the other metallic textures that Natasha's been playing with in some of her newer palettes that are just a little bit flakier. I think she tweaked the formula just a bit for that one. But let's talk about shades that are in this one that are not in the old palette. Let's talk about it. So we have, I would say, with the exception of Aria here, Every shade in this row is a new shade from the gold palette. So none of these other ones are from the gold palette. This shade Fizzy is a new addition. It's pretty. Don't think we needed it. We have Kava, and it kind of does the same thing. So let's swatch Kava, and I can show you what I mean. So Kava is a little bit more neutral in tone, but I feel like you don't need both of these in this palette. You see what I mean? Like I feel like you're gonna get the same vibe with these on the eye. They're both beautiful though. They're stunning. They're both stunning, and you can really get that beautiful like incandescent vibe. But these would actually make beautiful highlighters. So if you ever get the idea to like dip your highlighting brush and use those on your cheeks, I have highlighter on already. I would do that, but beautiful. But I don't necessarily think we needed both of those. Then we have the shade, let's see here, we have the shade Pana. And I want to make sure I'm wiping all this shimmer off my finger so I'm not getting shimmer in my mats. But all right, so we have the shade Pana, which is this shade here. And then we have the shade Nubia. And we have the shade Miko, or Mliko, excuse me. So these three. Now, this is my issue with these shades. These remind me way too much of shades that are in the I Need a Nude palette. Like way too much. I feel like, you see what I mean? Like those sort of like cool toned, champagne-y tones. There's nothing golden about these tones for me. Like this is not gold. This is nude, neutral. I feel like these could have been omitted. I don't think we needed these in that palette, in the golden palette either, because I feel like they don't actually fit with the theme or the color, the rest of the color scheme of the palette. I just feel like they're way too cool in tone. We then have Aura, which is the only shade, the only new shade in the second row. So every other shade in this second row are repeats from the original. The only new is this shade Aura, which again, I don't feel like needs to be in this. And I feel like it's maybe a replacement for the shade Sparks, which is in the original gold palette, and I will swatch that for you. But Sparks, in my opinion, is a better shade. So this is Sparks, and this is the new shade, which like I said, is called, yeah, Aura. So we have Sparks and Aura. I mean, I would rather have Sparks. I would rather have Sparks. That's prettier. It's more interesting. It's got slight reflect. This just on my skin is going to read as a white toned shade with a little hint of a duochrome to it, because when they both have a duochrome flavor, like they both have that, when you look at them in the light, they have a slight like greenish yellowish tinge. But with Sparks, because it has so much more dimension and texture, you're gonna see that way more on the eye than you will with Aura. Aura's gonna look quite flat unless you know, either apply it over something, you know, maybe apply it over a black or a deeper tone. But on my skin tone or someone deeper, it's just going to look white. Next up, there is one shade in I think this is the last one. Yeah, there's one shade in the last row that is also a new shade, and that is the shade Flesh. And I will swatch that here. And as you can see, it's just like a completely boring neutral toned shadow. Like if we were gonna have Flesh, we already have the shades from the original, which are, you know, you have Sandstone, Teak, Aria. These are all neutrals. I don't know why we needed this one. Like, it doesn't make sense to me. We didn't need Pana. We didn't need Milk. All of these really like champagne-y, peachy tones feel like a retread of I Need a Nude, and it makes me sad because in adding those shades, she's omitted some of these really beautiful tones like Dijon. Like, where's Dijon? Where is Dijon, and why is she not here? Why was she not invited to that party? Do you see it? Like this, the tones that made everyone so excited for the gold palette and so excited to use it are missing from this. It's missing that sort of extra special something. You know, it's missing its lime chrome, and it's missing, you know, here, I'll swatch lime chrome for you guys, and everybody loves this shade so much. And lime chrome is not even a shade that I reach for that often, but I recognize it for what it is, and it is a really special, beautiful shade. We don't have this. There's nothing like this in the new golden palette. There's not like this in and of itself. Look at that. See, now I want to do this. And what's funny is having this golden palette, it was fun to play with, and it is fun to play with. It's a beautiful, like, Natasha's formulas are great. Like, there's no argument about that. Her formulas are great. They perform well. I always have a good time using them. As far as ease of use and the looks that I'm able to create. I don't always love every palette. You know, I'm one of the few people who just did not like I Need a Nude. I thought it was very underwhelming and not very useful for anyone my skin tone or deeper. It was pretty, it's kind of a, I hate to say, a useless palette in that sense, because you can't get a whole lot from it if you're my skin tone or deeper. But the great thing about the gold palette was that it was a palette that a lot of people could use. Like, you could have a deeper skin tone and still get some beautiful looks out of this. You could have a lighter skin tone and get some deeper looks out of this, because you had shades that could create depth and dimension. Now, you have that to a certain extent with this, but the tones are so samey. This shade here is Log, which is also in the gold palette. So forgot to swatch it. I'll do that now while I talk about, you know, the fact that there just isn't a lot of dimension, in my opinion, in the new one. There isn't anything that makes it stand out. All right, so this is the, look at this. So this is the original one, guys, and this applied like butter. Like butter. This is the new one that applied fine. It applied fine. It's applied like butter, and you can tell that there is a slight difference. This one's a little bit warmer. So for me, this isn't a bust in the sense of like it's a bad palette. It's not, because the guts of it, the skeleton of it is very similar to, you know, to the gold palette, because the majority of the shades are repeats. But I'm just kind of perplexed as to why we repeated shades, but then left out the shades that made that palette so covetable. Like, the reason why people covet the gold palette and dream about that palette and wish they had bought that, you know, the gold palette, and are the shades that are still in the gold palette, but not in this one. I don't understand. I'm very confused by that. There are shades in here that are beautiful that you'll get a lot of use out of, but there is nothing about this palette that is particularly special or interesting. And I just kind of feel like I don't see the point in making a big deal about creating this new version of the gold palette with taking out everything that people loved about the gold palette and wanted from the gold palette. So that's my little take on that. Just having used both palettes, again, there's nothing wrong with the formula, but I will say this. Using this palette made me want to just use this palette. I used both of these today, and I found myself going, ooh, I really wish I could use Dijon for a look, but there's no comparable shade, so I had to skip it. Okay, so come to the end of this video, and this is just my little diatribe. I didn't want to do a whole thing with this because I don't necessarily feel like it needs it. There are a lot of palettes on the market that are dupes of this. I actually think you could get, if you have the Urban Decay Honey palette, you have this palette. If you have the Juvia's Place, is it Nubian 2, Nubian 1, Nubian 2, the gold Nubian palette, you have this palette for a much cheaper price point. If you have any palette that's sort of like a neutrally gold tone palette, if you have the Artist Couture Neutrals palette, the first one, you have this palette. If you have this palette, you have this palette, and you have a better version of this palette. This one was $129. This one was $69. Is that why she took out the things that made this palette special? Because she couldn't formulate these shadows, the special shadows in this one, to a $69 price point. I'm going to hazard a guess and say that's why. I could be wrong. It also could be that she didn't want to necessarily anger those of us who bought this at the $129 price point by releasing the exact same palette in a $69 price point. I don't know if that's a great argument, if that's a great strategy, because honestly, those of us who have the gold palette, we understand that makeup expires, makeup ages, makeup, degrades. And the reason why I keep my gold palette is because I can no longer get the gold palette. I can't get a new one, a fresher one. So I keep my new one, I keep this one. So if she had just come out with a $69 version of this palette, I would have still purchased it because it would have been like, great, I've got a new fresh one. The pans are smaller, so I don't have to worry about trying to get, and because that's why this palette, I've used this palette so many times, guys, and I will never hit pan on any of these shades. I just will never hit pan on any of these shades. So if we had been able to just get a smaller panned, cheaper version, a smaller version of this, I would have said, take my money, take it. I'm not upset. And I have a feeling that a lot of people who own the original palette would feel the same way, because we love this palette, but we all understand that makeup doesn't last forever. And I've had this palette for some years now. And when I saw her, when that sort of like that leak happened with the golden palette, I was hoping that it was just going to be, like gold palette part 2, smaller, more compact, new packaging, I thought it was going to be that. And it's not. It's just sort of like a very watered down version of the gold palette. So I will keep my gold palette. I will continue to use my gold palette. Do you need this palette? No, you don't need this palette, because again, all of the special things that were from the gold palette really aren't in this palette, guys. They're just not. They're not in this palette. I'm sorry to say. It's a beautiful palette. If you bought this palette, I don't think you'll regret owning it. I think this is probably a palette, honestly, guys, I'll reach for a ton, because it's so basic. It's so basic. Like if you're reaching for a neutral crease color, boom, there you go. You need a little gold, boom, there you go. You need a little taupe moment, there you go. But if you're looking for anything special, it's not there. It's not there. I'm sorry, it's not there. So yes, let's reveal which eye is which. So I'm going to zoom you guys in. I used the exact same shades on both eyes, so there's nothing on here that's different. This eye is the golden palette, and this eye is the OG gold palette. And I will say this, I found that this blended beautifully. I got such a great diffused blend, but I also think it's because the formula is slightly different. This one I got more color payoff right away. I was just like, boom, pigment, bam, there you go. This one was pigment, but I was able to blend this and diffuse it so beautifully. So, like I said, it's not a bad palette. I really enjoyed using it, and that's why I feel like I will get a lot of use out of this just on a day-to-day basis, dipping in for those basic shades that you use to create looks, I could see myself reaching for this and then reaching for some of my like Cleona singles and adding those in to create a more interesting look. You know what I mean? To create something special. But as far as these go, as far as the colors themselves, are they special? Do you need them? No, you don't. All right, guys, so that is the end of this video. Let me know in the comments down below. Did you purchase the golden palette? Do you own the gold palette? What are your thoughts? If you own the gold palette, were you hoping that she had come out with just like a cheaper, smaller version of the gold palette? I really want to know, because I feel like there's a miscalculation on her and her team's part about how people feel about repurchasing the gold palette, and how many of us would have just repurchased like a cheaper, smaller version of it. So let me know in the comments down below. If you own the gold palette, would you have repurchased a smaller, cheaper version? If you enjoyed today's video, guys, please be sure to hit the like button, and I will see you in the next one. Bye now.